Fáilte Harja, Fáilte Rov Gaji, Kalash Faraganacht. Welcome, friends, one and all. It is good to have so many of you here this evening for the annual PJ Corish Lecture Memorial. Great opportunity to honour the memory of someone who was a remarkable, really remarkable figure in this campus across both the university and St Patrick's College, and who had an extraordinary breadth of vision, great humanity, and a great interest, which happily stayed with him for his long-lived years. Some decades ago, when Paddy was still with us, there was one or two of the initial Pat Corish lectures, and knowing the modesty of the man, he found it very difficult to really be honoured. But I think it is very important that we do have this opportunity to honour him each year and to honour his memory and his contribution to the learning community. I want, in that respect, not to introduce tonight's speaker because that task will fall to Professor Ryan, but I do want to thank him for his industry and his enthusiasm and energy of everyone in his department, which amounts to one person, which is Professor Ryan. But hey, you know, if you've got a department, why not flaunt it? So, Salvador, well done. You have really, over these last few years, put a lot of effort into making sure that we are given the privilege of listening to exceptional scholars and people of learning, and I do appreciate that. I also want to say a word of thanks to many colleagues who are here from across the campus. Obviously, ecclesiastical history within the Pontifical University draws a great strength and support from colleagues in the Department of History in Maynooth University, and indeed from our colleagues in Russell Library next door, and a myriad of other connections which are the stuff and fabric of life here. So thank you to those of you who are here and those of you who have, as always, been a support. And indeed, a warm word of welcome to all others who are here this evening out of an interest in tonight's subject matter and tonight's very eminent speaker. It's good to have these opportunities. It's good to have these opportunities to listen to someone of such standing. It's also good to have the opportunity, I think, to make the connections between ourselves as families of scholars and families of those with an interest in this area. So I do hope you will linger afterward to enjoy some hospitality and some conversation. But in the meantime, may I just warmly welcome you again to this evening's proceedings, and invite Professor Ryan to come forward now and introduce our guest speaker, Professor Peter Brown. Thank you.
Augdroin Alskal Vanod, Augdroin Kalashta Forig, Manod, Aina Urka, Agina Ushle, Gullier. It is my great pleasure to introduce Peter Brown, who is the Philip and Beulah Rollins Professor of History at Princeton University. Peter is a native of Dublin, but he moved at the age of 13 to England, where he entered Shrewsbury School in Shropshire, with every intention of pursuing the science stream. Now, as he himself recalls, his housemaster called him to his study to inform him that, "Brown, you did too well in the entrance examination to do science. You shall do Greek." And thus was the world of science deprived of what surely would have been an equally pioneering career. The rest, indeed, was history and made history. From 1953 to 56, Brown read modern history at New College, Oxford, and would subsequently be awarded a fellowship at All Souls College, Oxford, where he taught until 1975. He was subsequently Professor of History at Royal Holloway College, University of London, from 1975 to 1978, and Professor of Classics and History at University of California, Berkeley, from 1978 to 1986, before joining the faculty at Princeton. Now, I think you'll all know that it's widely acknowledged that Peter Brown is one of the world's most gifted and respected living historians. It's no exaggeration to claim that it's only once or twice in any given generation that a discipline is graced with a scholar of his breadth and erudition. But not only that, one of the most striking achievements of Peter Brown is that he has succeeded in utterly transforming our way of looking at a particular period of history. Thus, he is credited with the creation of a whole new area of historical inquiry, that of late antiquity, roughly from 250 to 800 AD, running from the economic and military crises of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century to the rise of the Islamic Caliphate and the Carolingian Empire. Although he will doubtless humbly protest that he was not alone in this, there is little doubt that he is the defining figure in making us take late antiquity seriously as a concept and as a distinctive and decisive epoch of history. A period not of impending darkness, destruction, and decline as the Roman Empire in the West tottered to a halt, but instead of dynamic transformation. In the introductory remarks to his Haskins lecture, A Life of Learning, in 2003, it was said of Peter Brown, he is one of the very few scholars now alive who have in effect invented a field of study. That field, the burgeoning one of late antique studies, has since become an expanding galaxy of scholarship in history, religion, literature, and much more, for which Brown's work provided the initiating Big Bang. Peter Brown has command of at least 15 languages, including Welsh, Old Norse, Syriac, Turkish, Arabic, and Coptic. Although my source for this information is a few months old now, and he may well have picked up a half a dozen more in the interim. His publications over a lengthy career have formed and inspired scholars and discerning readers of good history alike for some 50 years. And certainly, from his landmark biography of Augustine in 1967, which one scholar has described as breaking Augustine out of his theological and hagiographical encrustations, making him live in a newly believable landscape. But there followed a host of other groundbreaking works, among which are The World of Late Antiquity, 1971, The Cult of the Saints, Its Rise and Function in Latin Christianity, 1981, The Body and Society, Men, Women, and Sexual Renunciation in Early Christianity, 1988, Power and Persuasion Towards a Christian Empire, 1992, Authority in the Sacred, 1995, The Rise of Western Christendom, 1996, Poverty and Leadership in the Later Roman Empire, 2002. And of course, his most recent magisterial, Through the Eye of a Needle, Wealth, the Fall of Rome, and the Making of Christianity in the West, 2012. And this comes in, that is his latest work, comes in at just shy of 800 pages, and has already won the Jacques Barzon Prize in Cultural History from the American Philosophical Society and the Philip Schaff Prize from the American Society of Church History. It also secured the R.R. Hawkins Award at the American Publishing Industry's annual Prose Awards. These are only the latest in a host of awards which Peter Brown has won over the years, not least, at last count, some 20 honorary degrees from institutions in 8 countries over 3 continents. One of those prizes was the Balzan Prize for those who have made outstanding achievements in the fields of the humanities, natural sciences, and culture. Indeed, Peter Brown was the first Irish recipient of this prize in 2011, joining a host of luminaries such as Emmanuel Levinas, Paul Ricoeur, Eric Hobsbawm, and Richard Southern. Son Ryan Diagachta Kalash Forig Maynooth, Farum fearful to Rotsa a father a nacht. Is more an honor going, Vehilaher Okoid specialta Marsha. Agus Hamid Exul Gomor, Lad a Leach de Clustáil, is the Vor Lane of Lasha. On behalf of the Theology Faculty at St. Patrick's College, Maynooth, I want to warmly welcome you here this evening, Peter. It's a great honour for us to be present at this special event, and we're looking forward very much to your lecture and to your sharing your breadth of learning with us as you address the topic of monks, labour and the holy poor, early Christian monasticism between Egypt and Syria. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Peter Brown.
Reverend President Salvador, I can't tell you how happy I am to find myself here, to find myself among friends in my own country, which grows richer and deeper every time I return. I was here last in 1977 as an external examiner for the Maynooth History Department. I was lodged in the bishop's room. A very solicitous lady would light the turf fire for me every morning, and as this was December, I needed it. She would also place the breviary at the correct page on the prie-dieu. She thought I needed that. It's a huge honor to find myself among you, and I hope this is a very small return for that hospitality which I once experienced at the hands of Monsignor Corish and his colleagues on that occasion in 1977, so that when Salvador wrote to me that he would offer Irish hospitality, I said, great. That's a tradition that has survived. I jumped at it. So let me begin with reminding you that really only a century ago, few people would even have approved of me for bringing the monks of Syria and Egypt to your attention. For until recently, we'd all tended to be the heirs of Edward Gibbon, the first volume of whose monumental History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire first appeared in 1776. Gibbon spoke with the sonorous and confident voice of the 18th century Enlightenment. For him, monks were unpardonable. They were dropouts. They were fanatics. He wrote of them with ill-disguised contempt as those unhappy exiles from social life impelled by the dark and implacable genius of superstition. I hope the community of Glenstal will pardon these words. And yet, nowadays, our attitudes have changed. To put it very briefly, we now tend to see the early monks who emerged in Syria and Egypt no longer as unhappy exiles from social life. What we've come to see, rather, is that far from being weird and wonderful dropouts, the monks acted much more as a catalyst for the social imagination of an entire society. Like many other extremist movements in other ages, early Christian monasticism was a sort of social seismograph. We can trace, often in exaggerated forms, like the rapid up and down movements of the needle on a depicts on a seismograph the more silent earth tremors of the normal Roman society from which the monks broke loose. Furthermore, we can see how those who supported the monks did so because they saw their own social dilemmas writ large, again, as in the dramatic high lines of a seismograph, in the persons of the monks. What happened at this time was very like what happened later in the Middle Ages, when the extremist poverty of St. Francis and his followers arose as a comment on the boom and bust economy of the 13th century Italian towns, or when nowadays the mission of Mother Teresa in the slums of Calcutta has come to focus in dramatic personal terms the anxieties of privileged nations in the face of the seemingly limitless poverty of much of the rest of the world. In the same way, from the 3rd to the 6th century, monks were very much part of the life of distinctive regions of what is now the Middle East and Northern Africa. At that time, I must remind you, these regions were the eastern provinces of a Roman Empire that was already half a millennium old. Indeed, at a time when Gibbon described as the period of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in the West, no such thing was happening in the East. In the East, the Roman Empire was still alive and well. Seen from the East, the end of the Western Roman Empire in 476 was a virtual non-date. This was because the eastern half of the empire was still backed by a buoyant economy, a world which we now associate only too easily with dry deserts dotted with ancient ruins, was thriving. It was the westernmost economic hub of a world system which reached across Eurasia along the Silk Route to the great cities of Western China, and which reached down through Egypt and East Africa into the Indian Ocean. We must always remember that, by comparison, Western Europe, on which Gibbon lavished so much attention, as he traced the awesome revolution of the end of the empire in the West, was a peripheral and underdeveloped region perched on the far tip of Eurasia. But furthermore, the discovery of ever-increasing numbers of papyri preserved in the dry sands of Egypt and in other parts of the Middle East have now enabled us to look inside the communities of monks and of similar ascetics. We can follow their daily life in a manner which Edward Gibbon, perched among his books in London and in Lausanne, could never have done, even had he wished to do so. Now, because of all this, we can enter into the minds of the monks on issues that were crucial for the nature of the society around them. And this is what I want to talk about this evening. I want to talk about a muffled debate on wealth, on work, and on the care of the poor, which echoed throughout the monastic communities of the Mediterranean and the Middle East, from Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, to the east, to the southern Italy in the west. Now, let me tell you first why I've been led to this theme. In the past decade, I've worked on the issues of wealth and the care of the poor in the Christian churches of late antiquity. But I find myself asking who actually were the poor. And I realized, increasingly to my surprise, that in the Eastern Christian world of the later 3rd and 4th centuries, there was as yet no simple answer to that question. My surprise deserves to be stressed. We now tend to take for granted that the principal duty of good Christians in the disposal of their wealth has always been to show mercy to the poor, the actual, real poor. We assume that this view already went without saying among the majority of Christians in around 300 AD. It was from this definition of the poor that the charitable ventures associated with later Christianity drew their strength. Yet, around the year 300, there were many Christian regions and many forms of Christianity where a different attitude was equally prominent. Many thought that Christians should give mainly, if not exclusively, to the holy poor, to the poor among the saints, to use the phrase of St. Paul in his letter to the Romans, Romans 15:26, when describing his collection for the poor saints of the community at Jerusalem. Yet these holy poor were thought to give the ethereal benefits of spiritual blessing, advice and prayer in return for being entirely supported by the earthly offering of daily sustenance, as if they were mere beggars, indeed as if they were the only beggars who really counted. Now, in the late 3rd and early 4th centuries, this division of opinion was particularly acute throughout a distinctive geographical area, or rather 2 areas. Hence the latter part of my title, Between Egypt and Syria. Now, in order to understand why this was so, we have to place our conventional image of the rise of Christianity against a wider geographical background than we are accustomed to do. We tend to think of Christianity as belonging largely to the Greco-Roman world and eventually to Europe. But this is to ignore the success of Christianity in regions far to the east of Europe. These regions formed an extensive third world of Christianity. Its dominant landscapes, its dominant languages were not Latin and Greek, but Coptic, the ancient language of the pharaohs of Egypt in its modern form, and Syriac, the last and eventually the most widespread and successful form of the Aramaic dialect which Jesus of Nazareth had spoken. In this period, particularly, Syriac developed into a Christian language of unusual expressive power. And it was both a language of religion and a language of commerce. As a result, by the year 600 AD, Syriac speakers were dotted across all of Asia, from Antioch and Syria, across Iran and Central Asia, to the Chinese western capital at Xi'an. It is to this great third world that we must now turn. Its central axis was defined by the sweep of what we call the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent joined Mesopotamia to the Mediterranean in a great northern arch, which stretched through what are now such unhappy regions, from southern Iraq to Antioch and then southward as far as the valley of the Nile. As far as Christian monasticism was concerned, the fertile crescent and the valley of the Nile, and not the Roman territories of Greece and Europe, were where the real action was. I will be dealing with three main groups of monks and missionaries who moved up and down the Fertile Crescent at this time. The wandering Christian monks of Syria, the missionaries of the Manichaeans from Mesopotamia, and the more sedentary but equally vocal monks of Egypt. Now, already in the 270s, the Fertile Crescent was crisscrossed by extreme religious groups of Christian origin. Those who joined them expected to be supported entirely by the alms of those to whom they ministered. They were a striking lot. A letter that was written in the late 3rd century to direct the behavior of one such group warned them that when they passed through pagan villages, they should not burst out into singing the psalms, which they usually did to hearten the local Christians, lest they be mistaken for a troupe of traveling musicians. Other charismatic wanderers came from yet further to the east, from central Mesopotamia. They were the messengers of a new prophet, the prophet Mani, who had died as a martyr at the hands of the Sasanian king of kings in 277 AD. Though vehemently rejected by other Christians, Mani saw himself not as the opponent, but as rather the reformer of Christianity. He wished to be the Paul of his own age. He sent his emissaries as apostles to establish his holy church in all regions of the earth, from the Roman Empire in the west to the Kushan kingdom of Central Asia in the east. He had the sweep of vision of a man who knew that in Mesopotamia he stood at the crossroads of Asia. The Lord Zoroaster came to Persia. The Lord Buddha, the wise, came to the land of India. Jesus the Christ in the lands of the Romans came to the west, and Mani would come to them all. Mani's missionaries soon established themselves as the elect of his church. They ministered to local Manichaean communities whom were called hearers or catechumens. When they arrived in Syria and Egypt in around 300, the Manichaean elect seemed much less foreign to local Christians than we might think, for they had modeled their behavior on exactly the same pattern of extreme poverty combined with ceaseless movement, which the radical Christians of Syria and Mani's own in Mani's own time had come to see as the distinctive mark of all true disciples of Jesus. In the words of the great Manichaean Coptic psalm, the Psalm of the Wanderers, discovered in Egypt, they went from village to village. They went into the roads hungry, with no bread in their hands. They walked in the heat, thirsting. They took no water to drink. No gold, no silver, no money did they take with them on their way. They went into the villages, not knowing anyone. They were welcomed for the Lord's sake. They were loved for his name's sake. Yet these dramatic groups of wandering mendicant monks, Syrian Christian and Manichaean, were soon met by an alternative version of the monastic life, primarily associated with Egypt. It's to Egypt now that we must turn. In the Fayoum oasis, just south of the Nile Delta around Alexandria, in around 270. That is less than a decade before the death of Mani in 277, and we must remember well over a generation before the conversion of Constantine in 312, Antony, a young Coptic-speaking Egyptian and a comfortable farmer, the owner of an estate of some 200 acres, such as would have made him a leading landowner in his region, decided to move out of his village. He'd been converted on hearing in church the crucial passage from the Gospel of St. Matthew. Just then it happened that the Gospel was being read, and he heard the Lord saying to the rich young man, "If you would be perfect, go, sell what you possess, give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven." Matthew 19:21. Now we should note that the steps which Antony was represented as having taken at the time of his renunciation differed very significantly from the pattern established by his exact contemporaries, the holy warriors of Syria and the missionaries of the Holy Church of Mani. Antony did not take to the roads. He took rather to the desert, and he stayed there. He became known as the first hermit, as an heremitikos, from the Greek word heremos, the desert. He was a man of the desert, not a man of the open roads. His renunciation also was accompanied by a dramatic act of almsgiving to the real poor, selling all the rest of his portable wealth, his house, furniture, silverware, and clothes. When he'd collected all the cash realized by this sale, he gave it to the poor. Furthermore, once he had divested himself of this wealth, he refused to receive alms for himself. Although established in the desert, Antony was believed to have maintained himself by the work of his own hands. His followers imitated him with studied intensity. The words of St. Paul in his letter to the Thessalonians, in which Paul was at his most anxious to avoid the accusation of being himself a charismatic freeloader, became the mantra of the monks of Egypt. For even when we were with you, we gave you this command: if anyone will not work, let him not eat. 2 Thessalonians 3:10. And so, by the time that Antony died, in 356 AD, the debate between Syria and Egypt as to the correct form of monasticism, which had already rumbled for generations between Mesopotamia and the valley of the Nile, was brought out into the open. And what was this debate about? It is not only about who should receive alms from Christians, the holy poor or the real poor, wandering charismatics or the indigent local beggars. This was swamped by a much larger issue, and this was how much was human society defined by the obligation of all humans to work for a living. How many members of this society could claim to be called by a religious vocation to live without patterns of work that characterized the life of the majority of their fellows? And last but not least, what claims, if any, did those who did not work have on the generosity of lay persons who supported them through pious alms? These were truly basic questions. They brought to the surface in Christian form millennial arguments on the nature of man and society. Different regions and different Christian groups answered them in very different ways. Their different answers revealed markedly different attitudes to society as a whole. It is in the light of their differing attitudes to the meaning of work that I'd like to interpret the various ascetic currents that flowed so vigorously between Mesopotamia, Syria, and Egypt in this period. Let us take the Manichees first. And with the Manichees, we begin with a stunning recent discovery. A little over a decade ago, a house was excavated in what had been known in ancient times as the village of Kelis, in the Dakhla oasis of the western desert of Egypt. In it was found a complete cache of Manichaean works, including a set of personal letters from members of the Manichaean elect to their hearers, their disciples. Now, Kelis lay over 600 miles to the south of the Fayum. We forget what a long place Egypt is. 600 miles to the south. But we know that in around 340, in exactly the same years as Antony was reaching the zenith of his fame in northern Egypt, the lady Irene, a catechumen, a hearer, that is, a lay disciple of the Manichaean elect, was being praised by the local elect for putting her treasure in heaven, in the manner distinctive to her sect. She was praised by the local elect for offering them material support, and in so doing she was following the command of Christ in the Gospels. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where no moth or rust destroys, where thieves do not dig in and steal. Matthew 6, 19, 20. And then it adds an explanation. Which treasures in heaven are the sun and the moon? That is, it was only this last telltale reference to the sun and the moon as active agents in a cosmic drama of salvation, which identified the writer of the letter as a Manichae rather than as an ordinary Christian. Now, this newly discovered exchange of Manichaean letters shows with the crispness of an X-ray photograph one path by which, in circles adjacent to mainline Christianity, treasure on earth might be thought to flow directly upwards to become treasure in heaven. The elect needed Irene and her fellow catechumens. You being for us helpers and worthy patrons, firm, unbending pillars of the church, while we ourselves rely on you. I was very grateful to you 10 million times, whether we are far or are near. Indeed, we have found remembrance among you. Now, therefore, may it stay with you, this knowledge and this faith which you have known and believed in. Therefore, I pray you, my blessed daughter, that you will send me 2 large jars of oil. For you know yourselves that we are in need here, since we are deeply afflicted. It is a very oily letter. But what did Irene gain from this exchange, and what views of the world were implied in it? Now, among the Manichaees, it was the nature of the material world as a whole in itself which was at stake. It was their view of the material world as a whole which gave a sharp flavor to their notion of almsgiving to the elect as members of the holy poor. For Manichaees, the material universe was hopelessly corrupt. Matter was evil. The best that could be said of it was that it could be used, in the words of a later Chinese catechism of the Manichaean faith, as an immense distillation plant. It was like one of the magical laboratories in which alchemists had sought, through a prolonged process of refinement, to wrench from base matter in minute ethereal fragments the unalloyed essence of gold and of similar time-defying substances. A sort of 100% proof spiritual pochine. Irene's gifts to the elect were therefore seen as a last thin vestige of matter, painstakingly prized loose from an inherently evil world, and sent on its way in the form of a solemn gift of food to the elect towards some final transmutation in the treasuries in the heights. Such wealth, offered in this way, somehow carried with it the very souls of its donors. These were the alms which Manichae lay persons gave to the elect, and to the elect only. For these were thought of as saving alms. They were offered to persons whose entire life had come to a stop. The elect were sealed on their mouths, sealed on their hands, sealed on their genitals. They were sealed off from process. They did not join themselves to fully living matter through unregulated eating. They did not contribute to the headlong pullulation of human flesh through intercourse and the begetting of children. Above all, they did not lend their hands to manual labor in the fields. With pale faces and soft white hands, the elect, men and women alike, for in this they were indistinguishable, they had left the world. They already lived on the threshold of the mighty cessation, which would eventually fall upon the cosmos as a whole. They were what their lay supporters might yet become. Now, such a view had palpable social implications. To cease to work was somehow, for a Manichaean elect, to bring to a halt the demonic whir associated with the world of matter. This was how Mani himself was represented as a young man. He had annoyed his fellow villagers by refusing to feed himself through tilling the ground and through plucking vegetables from the lush gardens that surrounded their settlement in southern Mesopotamia. Instead, he would stand outside the gardens and ask to receive his food as an act of almsgiving, as though he were a mere beggar. For the only relation to the world which a chosen soul such as his own was capable of was one of being as totally outside its sinister processes as a beggar was outside the normal processes of the agrarian economy. Now, the Manichaeans were not alone in confronting the issue of the relation between work, food, and the human condition. Deep thought on the drudgery of labor, on the ponos of work, to use the highly charged Greek term, the Syriac amla, the drudgery of work, was central to the radical tradition which also became so prominent in Syrian Christian circles in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. And this is perhaps not altogether surprising. As we saw, we are not dealing with a bankrupt region. The exact opposite. We're dealing with a thriving agrarian landscape. Syria was a zone of intense agrarian settlement. The same surge of population which, in the 4th and 5th centuries, had covered the highlands of Syria with villages of unparalleled density, also cast loose upon the roads an impressive number of charismatic wanderers who begged in villages which could well afford to support them. Furthermore, we must always remember that this world had roots which reached deep into the past. The zones associated with Syria and Mesopotamia had produced the great Atrahasis myth in ancient Sumer of the 2nd millennium BC. They had produced the opening chapters of the book of Genesis, where Adam was condemned by God to labor in the sweat of his brow. These great myths of the curse of labor in turn had spread across Western Asia Minor to influence the works and days of the Greek poet Hesiod. The careworn inhabitants of these regions of intensive agriculture had long wondered why it was that human beings had come, in the words of the Sumerian Atrahasis, to bear the drudgery, the dullum, imposed on them by the toilless gods. Seen against a truly millennia-long background, the exegesis of the fall of Adam and Eve into toil, which became current in a vocal, radical stream of Syriac Christianity, was only the last of a long series of sad ruminations, by means of which the settled populations of the Fertile Crescent had attempted to make sense, since at least the 3rd millennium BC, of the social trauma created by the agrarian revolution of the later Stone Age. Like all narratives of the loss of a golden age, where human beings had once enjoyed freedom from toil, radical Christian accounts of the fall of Adam and Eve presented human society as caught in the dull creek of ponos, of drudgery. Unlike the Manichaees, Syrian writers in this tradition did not believe that the entire material world had been corrupted, but they did believe, in no uncertain terms, that human society as a whole had fallen, and fallen deeply. Adam and Eve and their descendants had lost the first moment of sublime leisure. They had declined into the present careworn state of society, by which human beings were dominated by the need to work so as to eat, and by avarice for the land itself. Unlike the Augustinian tradition, with which we are better acquainted in the Latin West, the fall of Adam and Eve in this tradition had not brought about some profound inner weakening of the will, which was shown in its most subtle and enduring form in unregulated sexual desire. Rather, the true fall, the fall which blotted out all others in the imagination of many Syrians, had been a fall from the work-free abundance of Eden into the present world of toil. Work, dull work, and nothing as interesting as sex was the true curse of a fallen humanity. Syrians Christians, therefore, looked back poignantly to the days of Adam and Eve before the fall. This was the world they had lost. The Syriac author of the Liber Graduum, the Kitaba de Mascata, the Book of Degrees, explained in the early 5th century that before their fall, Adam and Eve had not known drudgery in Eden. Wrapped in contemplation, their labor had consisted only in the labor of the angels, the Pulchana de Malache. They had been workers, felachin, all right, but they had been workers of the Spirit. Their backs had not been broken. Their hands had not been hardened by earthly toil. Their toil instead has been the weightless, ethereal toil of prayer, joining their voices with the angels in ceaseless praise of God, their bodies swaying gently but without violent effort as they bowed before him. those who admired and supported the monks of Egypt, of Syria, of Syria. The monks of Egypt would be very shocked by that. The monks of Syria did so because they saw in them a touch of the long-lost angelic leisure of Adam come back again to their own times. Thus, throughout Syria and other eastern provinces, the spread of Manichaeism coincided with a wave of wandering, begging monks who considered that they were fully entitled to the support of the faithful because, being freed from the shame of physical labor, they were engaged in the weightless labor of prayer on behalf of all persons. They lived in a symbiotic relationship with lay disciples in whose economic activity they shared in no way, but on whose generosity they depended entirely. Now, it's against the background of these presuppositions that we should place the answer offered by the monks of Egypt to the Christian piety which had prevailed in Syria and Mesopotamia, and which threatened to make its way up the valley of the Nile. In the mid-4th century, the Christian regions of the East as a whole, Egypt and Syria alike, were as it were poised between two great and evenly balanced alternatives, represented by two conflicting wings of the ascetic movement. One wing, as we have seen, claimed to have risen above labor, to be entitled to support through the alms of the laity. The other wing, of which we know much more, because it came to be more fully represented in the monastic traditions of Western Europe, projected by contrast an image of ferocious self-sufficiency in which sedentary monks were expected to feed themselves by the work of their own hands. It was because of this wider debate, I think, that manual work came to enjoy pride of place in Egyptian monastic folklore, precisely because it formed part of a counter-image to Syrian practice. The issue of work in the self-image of Egyptian monasticism was peculiarly charged, and charged in a manner that was diametrically opposite from that presented in the Syrian world. In the words of a Coptic translation of what may have been the original draft of Palladius's famous Lausiac history, along with the conquest of the desert, the Pihobnejij, the work of the hands, was the glory of the monks of Egypt. Now, why was this so? I would suggest that work was embraced in Egypt because it summed up the stance of the true monk to society and to the world around him. For work was treated as a denotator of the monk's abiding humanity. Unlike the ethereal Manichaean elect, and unlike the angelic holy men of Syria, who seemed to float above the human condition, because linked to society only by the thin thread of alms offered by the pious, the Egyptian monk put himself forward as a normal human being, and this was plain for all to see in the most blunt manner possible. The monk was still linked to his fellows by the crude fact of work, by the need to sell the products of the labor of his hands, and even on occasion of the labor of his own body as a seasonal harvester in the field of local landowners in order to survive. As a result, aspirations of work-free angels in the Syrian tradition were the stuff of humor in the hermitages of Egypt. There was to be no room in Egypt for angelic wannabes. It was said of John the dwarf that one day he said to his elder brother, "I would like to be free of all care, like the angels who do not work, but ceaselessly offer worship to God." So he took off his cloak, went away into the desert. After a week he came back to his brother. When he knocked on the door, he heard his brother say, "Who are you?" He said, "I am John, your brother." But he replied, "But John has become an angel. Henceforth he's no longer among men." His brother did not let him in, but left him there in distress until morning. Then opening the door, he said to him, "You are a human being. You must work again in order to eat." Then John made a prostration before him and said, "Forgive me," and went back to his basket work. Thus, by around the year 400 AD, half a century after the death of Antony of Egypt, a battle in the social imagination had been fought and won in one crucial region of the Christian world, in Egypt. It was a battle about work, which involved the manner in which Christian monasticism would fit into society. But to conclude, we should not overlook the wider implications of this battle. If we do, I think it's because we tend to take the victory associated with the monks of Egypt very much for granted. We have become too used to the Egyptian model of the industrious monk, permanently settled in his monastery as a sort of holy kibbutznik. It was this image which eventually deeply influenced the rule of St. Benedict, which was drawn up for his monastery in southern Italy in the early 6th century. In later centuries, through the spread of the rule of Benedict, this particular version of monasticism became the model for the entire Christian West. We therefore assume that monasticism had always been like this. But this was by no means the case. If we look out at the great third world of Christianity, in Egypt and the Middle East, we find a very different social and religious landscape. We need to appreciate again, I think, the power, the sheer geographical extent of the alternative model represented by the Manichees and by the angelic monks of Syria. For when seen against the spacious background of Eurasia as a whole, the Manichees and the monks of Syria were the norm, and the self-supporting communities of Egypt and later of the West were the exception. Looking at the world from Mesopotamia rather than from Carthage or Rome, it's quite possible to imagine the emergence of a Christian monastic landscape that closely resembled the spread of the Sangha in Buddhist countries, communities, that is, of ascetic virtuosi, fed by their laity as part of an unceasing spiritual exchange by which matter in the form of food, clothing, and housing was offered in return for the ethereal spiritual goods of prayer and preaching. In following the fortunes of Christian asceticism across the Fertile Crescent, from Syria to Egypt, we have the privilege of listening into one end of a debate on labor and monks that was as wide as Eurasia itself. The outcome of this debate ensured that large parts of the Christian Middle East and Western Europe did not become what Eurasia, east of the Pamirs, northern India, Central Asia, Western China, did become at exactly this time, in precisely that in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. To use the words of the great Chinese Buddhist pilgrim of the late 4th century, Fa Xian, who walked all the way from China to India, following the route of the Buddha Sangha, along a chain of monasteries, each one totally supported by the arms of the laity. For Facien, these Buddhist regions were, in his neat phrase, lands of the begging bowl. Europe and Byzantium did not become what most of Eurasia did become. They did not become lands of the begging bowl. But nor should we underestimate the consequences of the victory in parts of Byzantine Christianity and in the early medieval Latin West of the particular imaginative model of society implied by an emphasis on the labor of the monks. Put in a nutshell, human society and the human suffering associated with real divisions between rich and poor took on a density that was somehow lacking in the cosmic option of the Manichaees, and even, for all their manifest compassion shown by their saints, even in the angelic option of the Syrian wanderers. For both these, Manichaees and Syrian wanderers, human society somehow lacked substance, dwarfed by the majesty of a fallen cosmos, as with the Manichaees, or overshadowed by the great sadness of Adam's fall into a world of toil, as with the monks of Syria. The present-day organization of society itself, its all too palpable divisions between rich and poor, represented but a thin sliver of the human condition. The division of rich and poor seemed insubstantial compared with the stark division between the freedom of a spirit-filled few and the dull servitude to material things in which the majority of humanity, rich and poor alike, found itself caught. By contrast, by claiming to live from the labor of their hands, the monks of Egypt asserted that they were not angels. Rather, they were fully paid up human members of a human society, a society characterized by sharp contours. They were linked by labor to the sufferings of that society. As a result, they found themselves responsible for alleviating its all too real ills through real labor. They worked not only to support themselves, but to fulfill a social duty by giving alms to others. Now, the monks of Egypt have all too easily been dismissed, as by the majestic Edward Gibbon, as no more than unhappy exiles from social life. But as we've seen, it's often those outside society who think most clearly about its ills and who bring its tensions most vividly to the surface in dramatic and arresting forms. This was what happened between Syria and Egypt in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. Through their insistence on the necessity of manual labor and on the duty of the monk not to be supported as members of the holy poor, but rather to work so as to support the real poor, the monks of Egypt did indeed bring a quite distinctive flavor to the social imagination of their age. They contributed in their own way to an imaginative victory which ever since that time has placed at the very heart of our modern conscience a model of society divided between rich and poor, in which the rich have a religious and moral duty to support the poor. So let me end in Egypt with the little-known words of the great Coptic monastic prayer to the Archangel Michael. We find the intercession of Michael in the strenuous work of our hands, in the quietness of the oxen and the growth of the lambs, in the body of the vine and in the gladness which is in the wine, in the fatness and the savor of the olives. we find the intercession of Michael also, when he is gentle towards those who are weary with toil, and when he gives them strength. Thank you.
Such a wonderful, breathtaking, wide-ranging, mind-opening, wonderful presentation. We have now some moments for questions or comments, but as you can see, this event is being recorded, so just for the sake of the recording, if you first of all could keep your question as short as possible, and secondly, because that will enable Professor Brown to repeat the question in the microphone so that it will be picked up. So we'll take some moments for questions, and again, to keep them as short as possible, it would be wonderful. Yes?
If we generalise, could we trace the Protestant work ethic back to the Egyptian monks?
What? Yeah, could we trace?
The Protestant work ethic.
Heaven forbid anything that Max Weber tells me to believe, I don't believe. On the other hand, I think there's a lot to be said for that, in the sense that one of the very interesting things about late antiquity is the development of what one would call a desacralized world, in which work is just work. The very fact that almsgiving is minutely, I mean, if you look at Egyptian monastic accounts or stories of the saints, what's fascinating is this is not a world of splendid gestures, it's a world of pounds, shillings, and pence. They really nickel and dime. And I think that's why we have so many actually invaluable monetary statistics about Egyptian monasticism, because even small amounts of money counted and were important. So as long as I don't agree with Max Weber, I'm quite happy to agree with you.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Brown. That's fantastic. I was wondering, sometimes medieval monasticism is associated with the aristocracy, and I'm wondering if that's the same in Egypt, if there's a class difference.
Yes, you ask actually very wisely, what is the class basis of this monasticism, Syria and Egypt? I think one thing we have to bear in mind is that we tend, when we study late Roman society, particularly the role of Christianity, to over-aristocratize it. If anything, Egyptian monasticism certainly has room for the prosperous landowner and what one might call, though it's terminally uncool to talk about an ancient middle class, but if you want to be uncool and talk about a middle class, it's in the Christian church you will find it. So what I mean is that you're not looking at a situation of aristocratic patronage, not at this time, such as we would automatically look for in, say, Francia of the 7th century. Instead, you are dealing with a society where there's a lot of money going around in relatively small units. This is very much the case in Syria. In Egypt, I think we tend to exaggerate the speed with which a major aristocracy did form in the 6th century, where by that time, with their Appians, with their basically kept monasteries, you could be in the Merovingian world. But this is not the case for the 4th and 5th centuries. But this is something well worth looking at in detail and probably generation by generation.
in the society that you're describing, there's of course a distinction not only between rich and poor, but also between free and servile. And I was wondering how you would fit servitude into your paradigm of poverty and labor, of Christian poverty and Christian labor.
One of the great paradoxes of Christian thought is that it just doesn't fit them in. The extraordinary degree to which slavery is taken for granted. And I think what's important about this is the extent to which what we would call medium Christians are often small slave owners, so that their sense of being a democratic people of the Lord is the sense of people who actually own slaves, even at a very low social level. So I think that it's hard for us to get our heads round a society in which the slave is all important but invisible in terms of social categorization. This doesn't mean that Christians did not encourage emancipation of slaves, of individual slaves. There's a Kellis papyrus in which of about 340, which is actually valuable because that's fairly early, about 3 value, in which a landowner does free his slaves, and he talks of it as the supreme essence of my Christian devotion. So certainly emancipation is treated as a pious act. If you look at the sermons of John Chrysostom, you get constant rebuke of slave owners for maltreatment of slaves. But a general questioning of slavery, quite frankly, I think we've got to sort of grasp that nettle and say, in that area, no. On the other hand, in areas such of sexuality, as Kyle Harper has shown in a very brilliant new book, From Shame to Sin, there was a very strong prohibition of sexual abuse of slaves, which of course made life very difficult for the average male Christian who was used to living on a double standard. So you're dealing with an institution which is grasping with something that's almost too large.
Professor Rowan, how would you situate St. Basil of Caesarea in some regard as the father of Eastern monasticism against the background that you presented?
I would say that he claimed to get it from Egypt. I don't think he did. But it's already testimony to the prestige of the Egyptian model. But what one must remember, that Basil is a Stoic philosopher, and that his actual attitudes to work in the monastery is much closer to that of Musonius Rufus than to that which we see in the Egyptian apothegmata. Basil is a giant. Like most giants, he stood very much alone.
I'm just wondering, Pope Benedict spoke Jesus of Nazareth. He said that John the Baptist may have been part of a desert community, and Christ was very much in amongst the people. I'm just wondering, would the Maccabees have followed more the John the Baptist model in their monasticism?
Well, they'd have been greatly flattered if you had told them so. You know, the whole mystique leisure of the monastic schema, of the monastic robe, which is quite frankly the equivalent of sort of blue jeans. But it takes on the mystique because it is the garment of John the Baptist, to such an extent that St. Martin of Tours and his aristocratic colleagues in the monastery at Maynooth virtually must have destroyed the local textile industry by wearing only imported camel skins. Yes?
In the early monastic period in Egypt, we see a lot of people referred to as stele dwellers, which lived high up on pillars or were other such hermits. How did they fit in with the largely work-centered community of monastics?
One thing is they're mainly a Syrian and northern Syrian phenomenon. Now, we do have examples. There's one very interesting papyrus in which a stylite hires a donkey to bring water to him and the monastic community at his foot. This is a relatively late papyrus, and by that time stylite could be a sort of honorific term. But real stylitism, that is quite literally the mountain ridge of the Jebel Saman and the Jebel Barisha, just dotted with towers, each of which had a stylite, like these awful wind veils nowadays. That is a very northern Syrian phenomenon and was actually long identified with this. When Daniel the Stylite came to Constantinople and set up his pillar, he was obviously treated as a Syrian. And there I think I should correct one thing which I found myself realizing as I read this. I used the word wandering, and maybe that's not quite right. If you look at, say, Buddhism, you find that Buddhist monks don't cover large distances. The important thing is that they break down compartments. That is, you wander from desert into city, city back, and so that if you go for a non-place, like the top of a column, or the bottom of an empty cistern, or a tomb, you are wandering in the sense you have broken a primal boundary between the cultivated and the sort of uncultivated. So I think I was using the brilliant title of Daniel Kahner's book, Wandering Begging Monks. But the idea that monks were wandering all the time is more a bishop's nightmare than a historical reality.
I'm aware of the danger of compromise in the mendicant tradition because of dependence on patrons. And I'm thinking of Irene and the oily letter that was written to her. And I wonder, is there evidence of Syrian mendicants being subject in any way to patrons in ways that their Egyptian counterparts might not have been because they were independent?
I'm sure Egyptians would have told you instantly, we are not dependent because we work. But any ancient philosopher would have told you that. You must remember the tremendous prestige of the philosopher who owed nothing to anybody. The true freedom of a person not caught in a web of reciprocity. So that is certainly the case. Now, could you repeat your question? Because I think there is more to it than that.
Were the Syrian monks subject to patrons?
Yes. it seems that for a longer period than we expect, they actually weren't to such an extent. One shouldn't generalize that. We know about the monks of Syria, for instance, through Theodorus of Kyros's religious history. Now, we know about the great monk Macedonius, who was known as the barley eater. He ate porridge, which is near to eating crude food as you could. Ancient people thought about porridge as Dr. Johnson did. Then you suddenly learn in a half sentence that actually his porridge was produced by the mother of Theodorus. And then you get a little story, and then you realize that he's got 50 monks also eating porridge, and they come from Theodorus' mother, and he has blessed Theodorus' mother. He has given Theodorus and his mother his own the belt of his schema, which he cuts in two and gives part. So yes, behind it there are patrons, but certainly in the 4th and early 5th century, there are no dominant patrons. I think that would be my answer, and it is interesting that the zone of activity of these stylite saints are precisely the mountain villages, which, as far as we can tell, are prosperous but not totally dependent on the great landowners. So there is a social map by which stylites turn up and continue to turn up in relatively autonomous villages. But the nearer you get to a big city like Antioch, the more they are likely to be tied to patrons. The great thing about an angelic holy man is they are basically very cheap. They really are notably cheaper. Land, the administration of land, the monasticism, and only eventually, even in Egypt, takes on land. The Egyptian church is remarkably landless. They prefer to keep it on a cash flow basis. And I think the monks do too, because if you look at some of the Buddhist texts, at the Vinaya literature, you get a feeling that monks have to account for every bathroom towel that is given to them by their patrons. So patronage can weigh in on you if you're totally dependent. It's complicated, sorry.
I take 2 more questions before we move on to another stage, if there are any more questions. Yes, Peter.
I believe you may have referred to it, but could you expand on, is there a difference in the almsgiving? Is it focused to a greater extent outside of the Christian community or primarily within the Christian community? In other words, taking care of the Christian poor before...
Oh, I think Christians reacted very much as Jews did. You support your own group first, but as Talmud said, for the sake of peace, you include non-Jews. And I think many a Christian, we should not think of early Christians scattering their wealth to the world in general. It was very much to the family of the faith. And they really did mean that. What happens is, in the 4th century, emperors insist that they have more extensive care of the poor, partly as a return for their privileges. So in some ways, they have massive charity. I mean, truly, by our standards, truly non-confessional charity forced upon them. By and large, the default position is very much the same as in the Talmud, in the Beulah tractate. Look after the Jews of the city first, and then for the sake of peace, be prepared to include pagans, which means to say that although the Emperor Julian made a great deal of Christian almsgiving as causing conversion to Christianity, apart from Julian, there's not as much evidence of that as we might think. Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks for your questions.
So it only remains for me to say a few concluding words of thanks. First of all, I would like to thank our host tonight, St. Patrick's College Maynooth, all the people who have been involved in the catering for our event here tonight and the reception that we're going to enjoy in Pugin Hall. I'd like to thank all my colleagues who were involved in any way in helping me and facilitating me as I tried to organize this event over the last few months. Anyone who is involved in any way in giving me support. And lastly, I think it is testament, Peter, to the esteem in which you are held, not only by people in this college or in this campus, but because this audience here ranges far beyond this campus. In fact, there are representatives from colleges right around the country to hear you here tonight. And I know also that people have travelled from the UK to be here tonight to hear you. And it's just a small testament, I think, of what you have given to us over a lifetime of scholarship, of erudition, and you have done it, I suppose, so lightly. You wear your scholarship and your learning so lightly. You communicate it in such a gracious manner, and you have really enriched each one of us, I think, tonight by sharing that very, very deep scholarship with us, and we are enormously and forever will be grateful for that experience tonight. So once again, thank you so much for what you have given to us tonight, Professor Peter Brown.